Hello again. Let's continue our discussion of carbon and carbon-containing compounds. Remember, we said that we'd be looking at aspects of organic chemistry being the study of molecules composed of or having as their key component carbon. All right, so let's consider it from a different perspective, slightly different. Now let's talk about functional groups. Remember, we said that all of these molecules that we're going to be discussing in this chapter, these important biological molecules, were going to be based upon hydrocarbon skeletons. But now what we're going to find is that we're going to be adding to that hydrocarbon skeleton things called functional groups. Functional groups are just collections of atoms that we find repeatedly making up portions of larger macro molecules, organic molecules, biologically important molecules. And what we're going to find is that the key features of those large molecules that determines how they function, what kind of reactions they get involved in, are going to be associated with those functional groups. Let's take a look at a quick example. Here we have two very similar molecules, right? Estradiol and testosterone. You can see that they have in common that four-ringed structure. By the way, whenever you see one of these illustrations where there is a ring structure and nothing is drawn right there, for example, you should automatically assume that there's a carbon there at that point between those two lines, and that carbon has hydrogens attached to it. Now you can see why this might be left out of an illustration, because if all the molecules we're going to talk about have lots and lots of carbons and hydrogens, it would become fairly complicated to try to have to draw those every time. So what you're going to find is that organic chemists, biologists, have chosen a shorthand way of representing molecules. So when you see these ring structures, you want to think of them as having carbons at each one of those intersections where lines come together. And you should assume that there's going to be hydrogens attached to them. All right, so now let's go back to the difference in these two molecules. Notice that in many cases, the molecules are the same. But there's some key differences in certain locations on these molecules. These are functional groups, some of the functional groups that we'll talk about. And because of those slightly different additions to this basic structure, these two molecules have very different functions. One of them, estradiol, is a hormone that influences female characteristics in organisms, like the female lion we see. The other molecule, slightly different functional groups attached to the basic hydrocarbon molecule, and now we have testosterone, a hormone found in male organisms. So you can see that these two molecules, even though they're very similar in structure, the addition, the change of a couple functional groups results in molecules that have very different types of functions in the organisms that have these molecules present. So let's take a look at some of these functional groups and see what kinds of groups of atoms we're going to be talking about. Here are the names for these functional groups, and these are the ones that I'd like you to be aware of. Please make sure that you spend some time practicing drawing them, and also you want to practice looking for them in molecules. So every time you get a chance that you see a picture of a molecule in the book or on one of our slides, take a moment to see if you can identify some of these functional groups. So we're going to have a group called a hydroxyl group. Sometimes people like to also refer to that as an alcohol group. A carbonyl, these are actually two related functional groups. One's called an aldehyde, and we're going to find that at the ends of hydrocarbon chains. And the other one is called a ketone, and that's going to be found in the midpoint somewhere of a hydrocarbon chain. So even though they're both carbonyls, they're slightly different because of their location or their position. The carboxyl group, which some people like to refer to as a carboxylic acid group, one of the reasons is because this group actually has the ability to liberate hydrogen ions when it goes into solution. So it fits the definition of an acid, doesn't it? So carboxyl group or carboxylic acid group. We have an amino group, sometimes referred to as an amine, a sulfhedryl group, which is sometimes called a thiol group, and then we're going to look at, finally, a phosphate group. Now remember, we'd expect all of these things to be groups of atoms that we're going to see attached to some type of carbon-hydrogen skeleton. All right, so we're still going to have hydrocarbon groups as part of molecules, but hydrocarbon groups would just be those portions of a molecule that are composed of just carbon and hydrogen. All right, let's take a look at a few of these. First of all, the hydroxyl group. You can see that the hydroxyl group is an oxygen with a hydrogen attached, covalently attached to each other. Sometimes you'll see this represented with an R written here. You could think of R as meaning the rest of the molecule, or think of it as that R would be the location where this thing would be attached to the hydrocarbon chain. Also note that the OH group might be written as HO. It just depends on which side of a molecule it's attached to. All right? So any place on this illustration that you see an empty covalent bond, that location where I drew the R group, you want to think of that as being, oh, something else is attached here. There's some other portion of some larger molecule that this is attached to. So now what the R actually stands for is what's referred to as the residual portion, but I like to think of it as, oh, that's where the rest of the molecule is. So hydroxyl group, remember, we mentioned that that might also be referred to as an alcohol group, and as you might expect, when we find molecular structures that are called alcohols, we find a number of these hydroxyl groups associated with it. That's why the name is there. The carbonyl group, remember I mentioned that the carbonyl group was one that might either be in the form of an aldehyde. So if we find this arrangement of atoms at the end of a chain, we would call it an aldehyde group. If we find this arrangement of atoms in the middle of a chain, then we refer to it as a ketone group. Two different variations on the carbonyl group. By the way, I'm going to take these two representations here and add some information so you can see that distinction between the ketone and the aldehyde. So for example, if there was more of a hydrocarbon chain here and then more of a hydrocarbon chain attached there, then we would have the ketone. Now, in the case of the aldehyde, remember we said it's going to be found at the end of a chain, and so we might have an R here to represent that there's a additional carbon chain attached there, and then over here we would have a hydrogen. All right, so they both have a similarity in structure, but because one of them's in the middle of the chain, it's the ketone. The other at an end of a chain would be the aldehyde. Next, here's our carboxyl group. Notice that it's a carbon, double bonded to an oxygen, and then also bonded to a hydroxyl group. All right, so this carboxyl group is composed of a carbon, two oxygens, and a hydrogen. Remember I mentioned that it's sometimes called a carboxylic acid, and that's because this hydrogen right here sometimes is released into solution as a hydrogen ion. And remember, we said that the definition of an acid was a substance that can release hydrogen ions or add hydrogen ions to a solution. So you can see why some people like to use the term carboxylic acid for this group. Let's consider some of the other ones. There's my amino group. Notice it's a nitrogen with two hydrogens attached. Once again, there's that vacant bond which would be attached to the carbon chain of the hydrocarbon skeleton of the molecule. The amino group is something we're going to see associated with a group of molecules called amino acids, and so you're going to see this functional group again when we talk about proteins. So make sure you pay attention to find it when we do discuss the proteins. A sulfhedral group is a sulfur with a hydrogen attached, and notice that this, as was the case for the hydroxyl group, might be drawn as bond SH or HS bond, depending upon which side of the molecule it's attached to, but it's a grouping of a sulfur with a hydrogen. By the way, this is also a functional group that you'll find is going to be important in terms of protein structure. So when we get to that discussion, make sure you look for those sulfhedral groups that are found in certain of the building blocks that we find making up the proteins that are found in the cell. Finally, here we have a phosphate group. Notice the phosphate group is a phosphorus atom with 4 oxygens surrounding it. As a matter of fact, sometimes you'll see this abbreviated as simply this. All right, that will be one of the shorthand ways of representing it. And so it's a phosphate group, phosphorus with 4 oxygens attached to it. Notice that one of those attachments between the phosphorus and the oxygen is a double bond. And so we're going to see this kind of structure associated with a number of different kinds of macromolecules we talk about later on. Just to give you an idea of where to look for it, it's going to pop up when we talk about one of the major groups of lipids. It's also going to pop up when we talk about the nucleic acids and their building blocks. So, once again, these functional groups are ones that you want to practice being able to draw or write. More importantly, you'll want to be able to find them and identify them in pictures of molecules. On one of your exams, I'm going to have a picture of a molecule, and I'm just going to have certain portions of it circled, and you'll want to be able to say, oh, that's the ketone, that's the aldehyde, that's the carboxyl, there's the phosphate group. So begin to develop that kind of recognitional understanding of these things so that you can find them in molecules. Let's consider an example. Here's a few molecules, just some molecules that are found in cells, and you can see I've highlighted some of the functional groups. By the way, remember that these functional groups are going to be portions of molecules that have as their basic structure a hydrocarbon chain. So notice we do indeed have the hydrocarbon skeleton in all of these. But take a moment now and see if you can identify these different ones, and then I'll go through them and see if you got the right ones or not. All right, well, first of all, here's one that's a fairly easy one. There I have a hydroxyl group, that OH group. Matter of fact, there's a number of these in this illustration, aren't there? Here we have that one that has sulfur in it. Yep, that's the sulfhedryl group. Over here we have nitrogen with two hydrogens attached. Right? That's the amino group. Over here, this is one that sometimes people will get confused. Here we have the carboxyl group or carboxylic acid group. Remember, if this was carbon double bonded to oxygen with just a hydrogen attached, not an OH, but just a hydrogen, then we would have called it what? Right, it would have been one of those carbonyl groups. It would have been the aldehyde. Finally, we have this over here, and this should be an easy one to get because notice it's part of the name of the molecule. That's our phosphate group. So anticipate that you're going to have to do this type of thing. Notice I'm not asking you to name the entire molecule, but I do want you to be able to find, recognize, identify the different functional groups that make up the molecules. And as we mentioned at the beginning, this is what's going to give these different molecules their different functions. So let's go back and just quickly recap what we started with. We said that we would expect organic molecules to have as a central organizing feature a hydrocarbon skeleton or a hydrocarbon chain. But what's going to give the particular type of molecule its special chemical reactivity, its nature, its functional qualities in the cell, what's going to determine how it works, are going to be these different functional groups that are attached to the hydrocarbon skeleton. Now, if we want to understand the function of molecules, one of the ways we can do that is by beginning to recognize and understand what these different functional groups do for particular molecules. And you're going to find that the presence of particular functional groups are going to allow us to begin to identify or classify some of the macromolecules, important organic molecules found in living things. Thanks very much. I look forward to talking to you next time.